I stayed where I was as the unmarked vehicle rolled through the fog and stopped just short of the broken bridge line, its tires crunching over loose gravel like it had been expected but not welcomed. Two people stepped out, both wearing plain jackets with county insignia barely visible under the low light. One of them scanned the collapsed span, then looked at the emergency vehicles still stuck behind the gap. The ambulance lights were still flashing, reflecting off the ravine walls. The entire estate behind the gate looked frozen, every house now quietly aware something had shifted. The man from the county spoke first, asking who authorized removal of a public access structure. No one from the HOA answered immediately. Margaret Whitmore appeared near the gate seconds later, her posture rigid, trying to control the scene without stepping onto the broken ground. I walked closer, my boots stopping just before the edge of the missing bridge. The county inspector turned his attention toward me when I mentioned the easement markings I had already seen. That was the first escalation because now the situation was no longer local HOA control, it was becoming a jurisdictional conflict. The inspector asked for documentation. I pulled up what little I could access on my phone, still unstable signal but enough to show the recorded county easement line crossing directly through the bridge foundation. A second escalation hit when the engineer, Daniel Brooks, arrived in a utility truck and confirmed the structure had been registered as an emergency access corridor, not private HOA property. Margaret's expression changed for the first time, not anger, but calculation. The gate behind her began closing slowly, as if the community itself was trying to retreat from the unfolding problem. I identified myself fully then, stating that I had been the recorded access compliance manager for that corridor under county authorization for the last 3 years, responsible for maintaining emergency passage integrity. That detail shifted everything in the air. The inspector immediately requested internal HOA permits for demolition, but none were produced. Instead, there was hesitation. Fragmented explanations, and references to a community improvement decision that carried no legal weight in his notes. The ambulance behind us honked once, unable to reverse or move forward, and that sound spread tension across everyone standing there. I noticed residents beginning to gather behind windows, watching silently as the truth of the situation expanded beyond a simple neighborhood dispute. Daniel stepped closer to the broken edge and pointed out that the support anchors had been removed in violation of recorded public infrastructure protections. That was the third escalation because now it was officially classified as unauthorized interference with a protected access route. Margaret tried to regain control by calling it an internal HOA matter, but the inspector interrupted her and asked for immediate cessation of all further activity. The construction crew had already stopped moving, watching the exchange instead of the equipment. The wind picked up again through the ravine, carrying dust across the exposed foundation where the bridge used to stand, and I realized this was no longer about what had been destroyed but about what authority had just been exposed in front of everyone. The county inspector turned back to me and asked if I had full records of the original corridor designation, and I answered that I did, stored in the county compliance archive, but retrieving them would reveal something no one in the HOA had accounted for, and that was when the inspector said he needed to see everything immediately before the situation escalated further. I stood at the broken edge of the ravine as the county inspector repeated his request for full documentation, his voice calm but increasingly firm as the situation around Ridgeview Estates tightened into something no one on the HOA side seemed prepared to handle. The unmarked vehicle remained parked behind us, its presence silent but constant, while residents behind gated windows watched without speaking, their homes now cut off from the outside world by the missing bridge. Margaret Whitmore tried to step forward again, insisting the removal was part of an approved community infrastructure improvement, but the inspector immediately asked her to provide written authorization and engineering approval stamped by county records. That was the moment the atmosphere shifted again, because there was no document ready to answer that request. I opened my phone and accessed what I had stored offline from the county compliance system, slowly scrolling through archived easement maps and infrastructure designations that I had reviewed many times during maintenance inspections over the years. Daniel Brooks moved closer to me, pointing at the exposed foundation lines and confirming that the original bridge structure was classified as a protected emergency access corridor, not private HOA property, which meant any alteration required county-level authorization that clearly did not exist in what the inspector was being shown. The second escalation came when the inspector asked Margaret directly whether she had ever filed a formal request to reclassify the corridor, and her hesitation lasted long enough for everyone present to notice. She responded with language about community safety and modernization, but the inspector interrupted again, explaining that intention did not replace legal jurisdiction. I could feel the weight of the situation increasing as more county markings were identified beneath disturbed soil near the bridge base, indicating the structure had been part of a broader emergency utility network that extended beyond the neighborhood itself. That realization changed everything, because it meant the bridge was not just a local access point, but a regulated pathway tied to regional response planning. Daniel confirmed this quietly, noting that any obstruction could impact emergency routing data already logged in county systems. The inspector then requested immediate access to HOA internal planning records and contractor agreements, but Margaret's team could not produce anything that matched the official scope of the work being described. Behind her, I noticed one of the construction supervisors lowering his gaze, stepping away from the equipment as if distancing himself from what was now becoming a formal investigation. The third escalation arrived when the inspector contacted county dispatch directly, requesting verification of authorization status, and the response was immediate and unambiguous: no permits had been issued for removal or alteration of the bridge structure. The sound of that confirmation seemed to travel across the entire estate, because several residents stepped closer to their windows, realizing the implications of what had just been admitted indirectly. I stayed near the edge, watching the empty span where the bridge used to connect everything, knowing that the missing structure was now evidence rather than infrastructure. Margaret attempted once more to frame the situation as an internal governance decision, but the inspector informed her that jurisdiction had already shifted due to impact on regulated access infrastructure, and that a formal stop work order was being prepared for immediate enforcement. As he spoke, I noticed Daniel reviewing a secondary map layer on his device showing the full extent of the emergency corridor network, extending far beyond Ridgeview Estates and connecting to multiple county-controlled routes that now flagged the location as compromised. The inspector turned toward me again and asked if I could provide full archival confirmation of the original designation, and I replied that the records were complete but contained classifications that would not only confirm the corridor status, but also reveal who had knowingly operated outside of it. And at that moment the county dispatcher came back on the line with a message that made everyone stop moving for a brief second of silence. I stayed at the broken edge of the ravine as the county dispatcher's voice came through the inspector's radio, cutting through the wind and silence like a final confirmation that none of this was staying local anymore. The message repeated once, clear and formal, stating that the bridge location had been flagged under a regional emergency evacuation network and that any obstruction triggered immediate state-level oversight review. For a moment, no one moved. Even the construction crew froze where they stood, hands resting on equipment without touching it. Margaret Whitmore turned slightly toward the inspector, trying to speak, but the words did not come out quickly enough to regain control of the situation. The inspector lowered his radio slowly and looked at her with a different expression now, one that no longer treated this as a neighborhood dispute. That was the first escalation shift because jurisdiction had just expanded beyond county authority into a coordinated infrastructure system none of the HOA decisions accounted for. Daniel Brooks stepped back from the exposed foundation and confirmed quietly that the bridge coordinates matched an emergency continuity map used for regional evacuation routing, the kind of system updated across multiple agencies and not controlled by private communities. I felt the weight of that confirmation settle in because it meant every action taken here had been recorded somewhere far beyond this gate. The unmarked vehicle behind us finally opened its door again, and this time a second county official stepped out, carrying a sealed folder marked with state infrastructure classification headers. He did not look at the HOA first. He looked at the ground where the bridge used to be, then asked for a full timeline of the removal. Margaret attempted to respond again, but the inspector interrupted her and stated that a formal stop work order had already been authorized at the state level due to impact on protected evacuation infrastructure. That was the second escalation because enforcement authority had now shifted entirely away from HOA control. I opened my archived files again, this time pulling up the original corridor designation map, and as I expanded it on my phone, Daniel leaned in and pointed out something I had missed before. The bridge was not an isolated access point. It was part of a continuous loop connecting 3 separate emergency routes that circled the entire district. That realization changed the entire structure of what we were standing in, because it meant Ridgeview Estates was never meant to function as a closed system in the way the HOA had been operating it. The second state official walked closer to Margaret and requested immediate disclosure of all internal approvals related to infrastructure modification, and the silence that followed was different from before. It was not confusion anymore. It was exposure. Residents behind the windows began opening blinds slightly, realizing that the boundary they trusted had been altered without proper authority. I stayed where I was, watching the gap in the ravine where the bridge once connected the 2 sides, and I understood that this was no longer about a single structure being removed but about an entire control system being questioned in real time. The inspector then confirmed over the radio that a formal investigation file had been opened and that all further activity on site must cease until verification was complete. Margaret finally stepped back from the gate, and for the first time, she was not issuing instructions but receiving them, while the second official turned toward me and asked if I was prepared to submit full historical access logs, because what had just been uncovered was only the beginning of a much larger compliance review that would determine how far this interference actually went. I stayed near the broken edge of the ravine as the state official opened the sealed folder, the paper inside marked with layers of authorization codes that did not match anything the HOA had produced so far. The wind pushed through the exposed gap where the bridge used to be, carrying dust that settled over the county inspector's shoes as he reviewed the emergency corridor classification line by line. No one from the HOA spoke now. Even Margaret Whitmore stood slightly behind the gate line, her earlier confidence replaced by a quiet stillness that did not belong to someone still in control. The second escalation came when the state official confirmed that the bridge location was part of a protected evacuation loop registered across multiple jurisdictions, meaning any alteration required coordination that bypassed private governance entirely. That single confirmation changed the weight of the entire scene again, because it turned what the HOA framed as an internal decision into a multi-agency compliance breach under active review. I opened my archived files again, scrolling through the original easement certification, and I could feel every set of eyes shift toward the screen in my hand. Daniel Brooks stepped closer, pointing out the continuity markers that linked this bridge to 2 additional access corridors beyond Ridgeview Estates, both still intact and now flagged for immediate audit. That detail made it clear this was not an isolated mistake but part of a broader system that had been partially ignored or misunderstood at the community level for years. The state official asked for all HOA internal communications regarding infrastructure changes, and for the first time, there was no immediate response from their side. Instead, one of the assistants from the HOA board quietly walked back toward the gated entrance, disappearing inside as if trying to retrieve something that should have already been ready. I noticed residents gathering more visibly behind their windows now, some stepping onto balconies, watching the exchange unfold without interruption. The silence was no longer passive. It felt investigative, as if the entire neighborhood was recalculating what it thought it owned. The inspector received another update through his radio, confirming that a regional compliance team had been dispatched and would arrive within the hour to document the site conditions. That was the third escalation, because now the situation had expanded from documentation review to active field verification. Margaret finally spoke again, but her words were directed at the inspector, asking whether temporary restoration of access could be handled internally to reduce disruption to residents. The inspector responded without hesitation that no internal action was permitted until full jurisdictional clarity was established, and that any attempt to modify the site further would be recorded as interference with an ongoing investigation. I stood there listening to that exchange, realizing how quickly authority had shifted from assumed control to enforced limitation. Daniel checked his device again and showed me updated mapping layers that revealed the bridge was not only part of an evacuation system but also tied to utility routing infrastructure that supported water and emergency response distribution across the district. That connection meant the impact extended far beyond simple access, reaching systems the HOA had never directly managed but had indirectly depended on. The second state official closed the folder slowly, then asked me to confirm the historical role I had in maintaining corridor documentation. I answered directly that I had been responsible for compliance verification and access continuity reporting under county authorization, which meant I had been tracking every approved and unapproved modification along this route for years. That statement caused a noticeable shift in attention from the officials toward the HOA representatives, because it established a documented record that could now be cross-checked against their actions. Behind us, the unmarked vehicle remained still, but its presence felt heavier as additional radio traffic confirmed more units were arriving. The inspector then requested full access to HOA board archives, and for the first time, Margaret Whitmore did not object immediately, only turned slightly toward her team as if realizing that what was stored inside those records would determine how this entire situation would continue to unfold, and the state official quietly stated that what had already been discovered was only the first layer of a much larger infrastructure audit that was now fully in motion. I remained standing near the ravine edge as the infrastructure audit expanded into its next phase, with multiple county officials now coordinating through handheld radios and live data feeds that were being projected on a portable screen brought in from the state vehicle. The wind had picked up slightly, moving through the exposed gap where the bridge once stood, and every gust seemed to underline how permanent the change had become. Inside the gated community, movement increased as residents began opening their doors, stepping out cautiously, no longer certain who had authority over what they had always assumed was private ground. The third escalation from earlier had not stopped, it had simply evolved, because now the audit team was no longer just reviewing documents, they were actively mapping the entire infrastructure network connected to Ridgeview Estates in real time. The state official instructed the county inspector to cross-reference every emergency corridor in the district database, and within minutes, additional flagged routes appeared on the screen, all connecting back to the same bridge that had been removed. That connection confirmed a larger system dependency that extended beyond property lines, tying the neighborhood into regional evacuation and utility coordination that required strict regulatory oversight. I watched as Daniel Brooks pointed out alignment markers between water distribution lines and the same corridor path, explaining that the bridge was part of a multi-system access structure that supported both emergency response and maintenance routing. That detail shifted the tone again, because it meant the disruption affected not only transportation but also essential service continuity planning. The county inspector then requested the HOA board submit all historical maintenance requests, infrastructure upgrade proposals, and contractor agreements related to any work performed near the ravine over the past 5 years. For the first time, there was a visible delay in response from the HOA representatives, who began speaking among themselves before disappearing toward the community office building. Margaret Whitmore remained near the gate, but her posture had changed again, less directive and more observational, as if she was trying to understand how much of the situation could still be controlled. I accessed my archived compliance logs again and expanded the timeline of recorded inspections, showing that the corridor had been repeatedly verified as active and protected in county systems, with no approved modification requests ever submitted. The state official reviewed the logs carefully and confirmed that the documented maintenance records aligned with protected infrastructure status, which meant any removal activity required formal authorization that had not been granted. That confirmation triggered another escalation, because it established a clear discrepancy between recorded law and executed action. Behind us, additional county vehicles arrived, carrying technical specialists equipped with mapping tools and structural assessment equipment, preparing to document the site in detail. One of the specialists approached the exposed foundation and began scanning reference points where the bridge supports had been anchored, comparing them against archived structural diagrams displayed on a tablet. The data confirmed that the original construction was integrated into a broader corridor stabilization system, meaning its removal had potential downstream impact beyond the immediate location. Residents inside the estate began reacting more visibly now, with some pointing toward the officials while others quietly recorded the scene on their phones from behind windows and partially open doors. I noticed that the unmarked vehicle had repositioned slightly, maintaining a clear line of sight to both the ravine and the HOA gate, as if documenting the entire interaction without interruption. The county inspector then announced that all further HOA activity on infrastructure grounds was suspended pending full compliance review, and that any attempt to proceed with internal modifications would be logged as active interference with an open state-level investigation. Daniel showed me a secondary system layer on his device that revealed additional interconnected routes extending beyond the neighborhood, indicating that Ridgeview Estates was a midpoint node within a larger emergency grid that spanned multiple districts. That realization reframed everything that had happened, because it was no longer about a single bridge being removed but about a critical link in a regulated system being disrupted without authorization. The state official then asked me to confirm whether I could provide complete continuity records for the corridor from the initial certification date to the present, and as I prepared to respond, I understood that the next phase of this investigation would not only examine what had been done to the bridge, but who had made decisions that assumed control over infrastructure they were never authorized to change. I stayed near the ravine as the state audit team shifted from verification to full-scale evidence reconstruction, their portable screens now showing layered infrastructure maps that connected Ridgeview Estates to multiple emergency corridors across the district. The county inspector instructed everyone on site to maintain position while the compliance specialist synchronized data from archived county servers, pulling historical records that had not been fully reviewed in years. That was the moment the investigation stopped being reactive and became structural, because every system layer tied to the bridge removal was now being reconstructed in real time. Daniel Brooks stood beside me, pointing at a live overlay showing utility routing paths intersecting directly through the collapsed bridge zone, confirming again that this was not an isolated structure but part of a regulated continuity network. The second escalation from earlier investigations now expanded further, because the state system flagged additional inconsistencies in HOA submitted activity logs that did not match county maintenance records. I watched as one of the compliance officers highlighted missing entries in the timeline, specifically gaps where no authorization or inspection reports existed despite recorded physical modifications in the field. That discrepancy triggered an immediate request for all internal HOA communication archives, including emails, contractor messages, and board meeting records related to infrastructure decisions. Inside the gated community, movement increased again, but this time it was different. Residents were no longer observing silently, some were attempting to speak with HOA representatives who had retreated into the community office building. Margaret Whitmore finally reappeared near the gate, but she was now accompanied by two board members carrying physical binders, as if trying to reconstruct a paper trail under pressure. The state official reviewed the submitted materials without taking his eyes off the digital map feed, and within seconds it became clear that the documentation provided did not align with any approved infrastructure modification sequence. I accessed my archived compliance logs again and projected the original corridor certification file to the inspector, showing time-stamped entries of maintenance verification that had been signed and validated across multiple county departments over the years. That confirmation created another escalation point, because it established that the corridor had continuous legal protection status during every period in which unauthorized modification was now being confirmed. The inspector immediately instructed the compliance team to cross-reference contractor registration databases, and within minutes, a mismatch was identified between the company listed in HOA documents and any licensed entity authorized to perform structural work in regulated corridors. Daniel leaned closer and pointed out that the equipment used during removal had identification markers that corresponded to a subcontractor group that had previously been flagged in unrelated infrastructure audits in neighboring districts. That detail expanded the scope again, suggesting coordination failures beyond a single site. The state official then issued a directive to freeze all remaining HOA-related infrastructure activity pending full forensic document review. At that moment, the unmarked vehicle behind us repositioned slightly, and additional state personnel arrived carrying sealed data retrieval units intended for secure extraction of digital records from the HOA office systems. Inside the community, lights began turning on in multiple homes as residents reacted to the increasing presence of officials and equipment, realizing that this situation was no longer contained within board decisions or internal governance. I remained focused on the exposed ravine where the bridge once stood, now marked with survey equipment and temporary boundary indicators being placed by the compliance team. The inspector asked me again to confirm whether I could provide uninterrupted continuity verification for the corridor, and I confirmed that every inspection record, modification log, and approval stamp had been maintained under county compliance oversight without exception. That confirmation triggered a final escalation in this phase, because it allowed the state team to establish a verified baseline of authorized infrastructure status against which all HOA actions could now be measured. Margaret Whitmore attempted to speak with the state official directly, but he redirected her to formal compliance channels, stating that all communication would now be processed through the investigation record system rather than informal explanation. As the compliance team finalized their initial field assessment, Daniel showed me a deeper system layer that revealed additional dependent infrastructure nodes connected to the same corridor, extending into utility support lines that served multiple residential zones beyond Ridgeview Estates. That discovery reframed the entire investigation once more, because it confirmed that the bridge removal had initiated a chain reaction across a regulated network that required immediate statewide review. The state official closed his tablet briefly, then stated that the next phase would involve full audit reconciliation between county infrastructure records and HOA governance actions, and as he spoke, I understood that what had begun as a single disputed bridge had now expanded into a complete examination of authority, responsibility, and control across an entire interconnected system. I remained at the ravine as the investigation moved into full enforcement mode, with state compliance units establishing a temporary command point near the broken bridge site and extending their data systems directly into the Ridgeview Estates administrative network. The portable screens were now showing synchronized overlays of infrastructure records, contractor logs, and county authorization archives, all being compared in real time against the HOA's internal submissions. The county inspector stood beside the state official as they reviewed the latest audit results, and the tone of the entire operation shifted again from verification to formal escalation. That was the first escalation in this phase because the evidence threshold had now been met for regulatory enforcement action beyond review. A sealed directive arrived through the state communication channel authorizing immediate suspension of all HOA infrastructure governance privileges related to the affected corridor system. Inside the gated community, the atmosphere changed visibly as residents began moving outside their homes, watching officials place compliance markers along the internal access roads. Margaret Whitmore was no longer speaking with authority, she was responding to requests for documentation from multiple agencies at once, while her team attempted to retrieve digital records from the community office systems under supervision. I stood with Daniel Brooks near the ravine edge as he confirmed that the infrastructure network map now displayed full dependency chains linking Ridgeview Estates to two separate emergency routing systems and a regional utility backbone that required uninterrupted access compliance. That confirmation expanded the scope again because it established that the bridge removal had triggered a regulatory breach affecting interconnected public systems. The state official then authorized a forensic extraction of all HOA digital records, and technicians entered the community office with secure data units to mirror every server log, communication archive, and contractor file in a controlled environment. That moment marked the second escalation because the investigation had transitioned from field audit to full system replication for legal review. I accessed my archived compliance logs again and watched as the county system integrated my historical verification records into the master audit timeline, creating a continuous chain of certified infrastructure status across multiple years. Daniel pointed out that several contractor entries in the HOA records did not match any licensed entity in the state database, and instead corresponded to inactive or flagged service groups previously associated with irregular infrastructure work in other districts. That discrepancy immediately triggered a secondary compliance alert, expanding the investigation into cross-jurisdictional review. Behind us, residents gathered more openly now, some asking officials questions about access restoration and service continuity, while others remained silent as they processed the scale of what was unfolding. The unmarked state vehicle transmitted updated logs. To the central system, and additional enforcement personnel arrived carrying expanded mapping equipment to document every structural change around the ravine. The county inspector confirmed that interim access restoration planning would begin only after full structural and legal verification was complete, and that no private governance entity would be permitted to modify infrastructure until the audit concluded. Margaret attempted to coordinate a statement through her legal representative, but the state official redirected all communication into the formal compliance record, stating that only documented submissions would be considered valid within the ongoing review process. I watched as the compliance team finished their first full reconstruction of the corridor system digitally, revealing how the bridge had functioned as a critical junction within a larger regulated network that extended beyond the neighborhood boundaries. That visualization made the consequences of the removal fully visible for the first time, showing cascading dependencies across emergency, utility, and access systems that required immediate stabilization planning. Daniel stepped closer and noted that the reconstructed system map now highlighted multiple alert zones across the district, indicating that additional infrastructure assessments would be required beyond Ridgeview Estates. The state official then confirmed that a formal enforcement order was being prepared to transfer oversight of all affected infrastructure segments into temporary public administration until compliance integrity could be restored. As he spoke, I realized the situation had moved beyond investigation and into systemic correction, where every decision made in the past days would now be evaluated against verified infrastructure authority records, and the inspector quietly added that the next phase would determine responsibility across every level of governance involved in the unauthorized changes, while the entire system prepared to reveal who had authorized actions that were never legally permitted. I remained at the ravine as the final phase of the audit transitioned into formal resolution, with the state enforcement team now operating under a fully activated compliance directive that consolidated every recorded finding into a single jurisdictional report. The portable command screens that had once displayed fragmented infrastructure data now showed a unified system map of Ridgeview Estates and its connected emergency and utility corridors, all marked with verified status changes and documented violations. The county inspector stood beside the state official as they reviewed the final audit summary, and the atmosphere around the site shifted from investigation to enforcement closure. That shift marked the first escalation of resolution, because the findings were no longer being analyzed, they were being officially codified into regulatory action. A formal order was read aloud confirming that all unauthorized infrastructure modifications performed by the Homeowners Association were invalid under county and state infrastructure law, and that control of the affected corridor system would be transferred to temporary public oversight pending full restoration. Inside the gated community, residents gathered in larger numbers now, no longer observing from distance but standing openly near the internal roads as compliance officers placed official markers indicating jurisdictional transition points. Margaret Whitmore stood near the community entrance with members of her board, listening as the state official detailed each violation recorded across the audit timeline, including the absence of approved permits, the mismatch of contractor credentials, and the disruption of a protected emergency access network. I stayed near Daniel Brooks as he confirmed that the restored system map now reflected a fully reconciled corridor network, with the bridge location marked for reconstruction under county supervision and integrated into a verified emergency routing framework. That confirmation represented the second escalation of resolution because it established continuity restoration as an active state-managed process rather than a community-controlled decision. I accessed my archived compliance logs one final time and watched as they were officially integrated into the final audit record, validating years of corridor inspections and maintenance verification that had been used to reconstruct the legal status of the infrastructure system. The state official then confirmed that all prior unauthorized decisions affecting the bridge removal would be forwarded to the appropriate regulatory review board for administrative accountability assessment, ensuring that governance responsibility would be formally evaluated under infrastructure compliance statutes. Behind us, reconstruction planning teams arrived with survey equipment and structural modeling systems, preparing to design a restored bridge aligned with the verified emergency corridor specifications. Residents watched as the first restoration markers were placed, signaling the beginning of physical recovery for the access route that had been disrupted. Daniel pointed out that the updated system now showed full redundancy pathways across the district, meaning emergency access stability had been re-established at a regional level. The county inspector then approached me directly and confirmed that my compliance records had been instrumental in validating the historical continuity of the corridor system, ensuring that the audit could establish a clear baseline of lawful infrastructure status. Margaret Whitmore attempted to issue a final statement through her legal representative, but the state official concluded the session by stating that all governance actions taken outside of recorded authorization would be subject to formal review and that operational control of the infrastructure system had been fully reassigned to public oversight until compliance restoration was complete. As the enforcement teams began demobilizing from the ravine, I looked across the rebuilt data map showing the bridge site now marked not as a point of conflict but as a restored connection within a verified emergency network, and I understood that what had begun as a single blocked access point had ultimately exposed a complete system of authority correction, ending with the infrastructure returning to lawful control and the entire district regaining a stable and regulated pathway forward.